Hi guys. All right, so we are wrapping up chapter 18. They are remember the ectothermic vertebrates. They are animals that use the environment to control their body temperature, and they are animals that have a spine. So we've already talked about fish and amphibians. We dissected the frog, and so we are moving on to reptiles. Reptiles are in general a very diverse group, and that is because of their skin. Their skin is scaly and dry, and that feature allows them to live in really hot, dry areas because they have these scales that help them to keep water in, or they can even live in wet, like salty areas like the ocean, because for most animals, the salt would really dry their skin out, but these guys have scales, and so they avoid that. Amphibians, you will never find a frog living in really hot places or in really salty areas because their skin would get too dried out. All right, so now reptiles are amniotes. So it's the first time we've talked about that word. And these are vertebrates whose embryos are surrounded by what is called an amnion. And that amnion is a membrane that holds fluids, that holds some other stuff we're going to talk about in a minute. But all of that stuff is there basically to protect and to cushion and nourish the embryos. So an amniotic egg, and so this would describe a reptile egg, would also describe like a chicken egg, contains a yolk sac. First of all, it's a yolk. So when you open up an egg and see the yolk, this is that. And it is basically just a big sac of protein that feeds the embryo. Then they also have an allantois, and this is like a waste storage. It's like a little just like a little porta potty basically inside the egg that waste goes into. And then there is another membrane called the chorion, and that surrounds these structures. And so, you know, when you crack open an egg, sometimes you just crack the shell, but the membrane is still intact. You're basically looking at the chorion in that instance, and then you can break through that to actually get to the egg. Now, reptiles are also, for the most part, and we'll talk more about it, but they're also oviparous, which means that they lay eggs with their embryos inside, and the entire egg is surrounded by a shell. And so it has a calcium-based shell for the most part, kind of give or take on that compared to like a chicken egg, but it gives them like kind of a hard, protective shell. Okay, so now the reptile groups. Reptiles are divided into four main groups. Three of them are pretty familiar to us. The fourth one is kind of weird, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But first of all, you have the turtles. And I have a little picture of a turtle up there, and I think he just looks super majestic and proud of himself. So that's why I chose that one. But he has, or she has, a hard plate or hard shell that's made of plates. And those plates are connected to the ribs and the vertebrae in the back, as well as kind of wrapping around and underneath and connecting to the ribs in the front. And they even have, and this is the pattern that you can see on the shell, little plates or little scales called scutes. And those scutes are made of keratin, which is very similar to what your fingernails are made of. And those scutes sit on top of the plates and provide an extra layer of protection. Their head and their legs, their tails are covered like scales, just like any other reptile. So they have kind of two different types of skin, or two types of outer layer. Then we have the lizards and snakes. So I have a little lizard there looking at the turtle. They have all the stuff. They have the scaly skin. They can survive, dry or salty areas. One of their big characteristics is that most of them have very loosely attached lower jaws, which means they can swallow things that are much larger than they are. Horrifying as it may be, there are boa constrictors that are large enough that they could swallow a person, which has actually happened. And so because they can unattach that lower jaw. Then you have the crocodilians, so the crocodiles and alligators. They are known in general for their longer snouts. Of course, their teeth are kind of a big deal too. They also, in general, have the ability at least to grow to probably the largest size of all of these guys. Okay, so those three are pretty familiar. This last one, the tartaras, there are only two known species of the tartaras. Both of them live in New Zealand. They probably were kind of a later discovery, at least compared to the other three orders that we've talked about, which is why they kind of stand out a little bit. Their appearance is very similar to a lizard, but they have peaks and kind of ridges on their backs that are formed by those by the scales. Lizards in general are pretty smooth. So anyway, so they're a little bit unusual, but they do get into this group because of their scales. All right, so now some structures. I've said quite a bit already about the scales, but that scaly skin keeps water in, and it can be composed of scales. And the squamates, which are the lizards and snakes, are the tartaras. The crocodilians tend to have the scutes, more of the bigger, larger scales, and then turtles have both. They have scales and scutes, so they have a combination. The animals that have simply or strictly scales, the snakes and the lizards, the tartaras, they tend to shed their skin as they grow, and they can either shed it in little bits and pieces or as a whole, and that allows them to grow. I can remember as a kid when we would go out to our land, finding like snake skins out, especially in the spring. You could just, like be walking through the pasture and there'd be a snake skin laying there. So they have to shed them as they grow. It gives them more space. And then the crocodilians and the turtles, they don't shed anything. Well, the turtles on their legs do, but their scutes, they basically just add more layers as they get worn down. And so it's a little bit different skin. They do have a 3-chambered heart, so this is similar to the frog heart, but the ventricle, the pump, basically, the one that is more muscular, it has a septum. Septum means wall, and this wall partially divides the ventricle, and it prevents the blood from mixing. It prevents blood that doesn't have oxygen from mixing with blood that does have oxygen, because both will come into the heart at different times. And so it kind of helps the animal to get a little bit more out of the blood. And it's kind of an advancement as far as heart structure goes. There is an exception, of course, because there always are, but crocodilians are actually 4-chambered animals, just like mammals, just like you. And in general, that's probably because, or one of the reasons that they can become so much bigger. They're a little more efficient in their blood circulation. All right, reptiles are pretty intelligent as far as comparison to other animals. They have very complex brains comparatively. They can see in color, most of them, and so this makes them good hunters. This makes them very aware of their environment. They do, though, have a fairly poor sense of hearing, and so that's kind of bad for them. For most of them, though, it is not too detrimental because they are so close to the ground that they can hear, or not hear, they can feel vibrations if something is coming towards them, so they make up for it. All right, now two kind of special things. The Jacobson's organ. This is a little organ in the roof of their mouth that they use to taste the air. And this tasting the air helps them to sense, again, what is around them, helps them to sense prey, and makes them pretty good hunters. It's the reason why reptiles flick their tongues in and out so much. They're smelling or tasting the air. And then they, in a group called the pit vipers, you have what they call heat sensing pits. And these are little pits on their heads that are used to detect body heat. And so it's like a little kind of infrared. And they can use this to detect the body heat of their prey. And again, it's helpful for the hunters. All right, now digestive system. Most reptiles are carnivores, which means that they hunt, they eat other animals. And for the most part, they have teeth and a pretty good set of teeth, but those teeth are designed for grabbing and tearing. They don't have molars, like they don't chew things. And so when they swallow their food, it's in big chunks. Not a lot of digestion takes place until the food gets to their stomachs. And so that's where a lot of chemicals are added in. Their stomachs are very muscular, so they can really kind of mush the food up. And then the food moves into the small intestine where the nutrients are absorbed. Water is absorbed in the large intestine, and that's very important because remember they are in pretty extreme conditions as far as water is concerned. And then they get rid of waste through their cloaca. Land reptiles work so hard in their desert regions to preserve water that they almost never produce any form of liquid. Their waste is mostly uric acid, and it's a solid form, so kind of different for what we're used to. And then just one little thing to note, marine reptiles, so reptiles that live in salt water, they have to work pretty hard to not build up too much salt in their system. And many of them have a salt gland right near their eye, in the corner of their eye, and it removes all of that excess salt that they are taking in, and it excretes it, and basically they cry, and it is concentrated salt water. So you may have heard the term crocodile tears. That originates from this salt gland that is near their eyes. Okay, reproduction. So all reptiles use internal fertilization, so the sperm has to enter the female's body. Some of them bear live young. Lizards and snakes very often do, and others lay eggs. It just kind of depends on the species. Most eggs that are produced by reptiles have more of a leathery feel. They have a little bit more give to them than like a chicken egg, and that's because they have a little less calcium in the shell. Some lizards and snakes are known for being all female. There are no males of certain species, and so these will only reproduce asexually, which is a little bit unusual. And then as far as caring for their young, most reptiles will find an area, dig a hole and lay their eggs, and that's it. Crocodiles, strangely enough, are quite maternal as far as their eggs are concerned. The females will very aggressively guard their nests, and once they hear or sense the eggs opening or hatching, they will dig them out and break open the nests for the eggs. Many of them will carry their young in their mouths to water or to wherever they're going to be, and protect them, some for more than a year of their life. And I put that little picture on there just because I thought it was kind of cute, and that is a mother alligator carrying her babies around. Notice there's lots of them. They do usually lay quite a few eggs, and so they are they're pretty good moms. Now most reptiles will lay either batches of males or females, and that very often depends on the temperature of the nest, and it will determine the sex of the offspring. In some situations, lower temperatures mean the eggs will be female and higher will be male, or vice versa. Some of them, if it's an extreme, either cold or really hot, they're female, and if it's a middle temperature, it's a male. And so there's all kinds of variations there. Okay, so last but not least, so in the environment, reptiles are all over the place as far as the food chain is concerned. Most of them, especially of course like the crocodiles, alligators, are at the top of the food chain in their area or in their zone, but very often are at the bottom of the food chain when they are young, and especially as eggs. It's one of the reasons that mother crocodiles are so protective of their nests. Birds and other reptiles, even some mammals, rodents in particular, are known for breaking into the nests of these reptiles and eating the eggs. And so they are a good food source for those types of animals, but once they get big enough, then you better watch out because they're the top then. Now, one of the things that people have seen, ecologists, conservationists, have noticed that reptiles tend to lay their eggs in places that people like to go, like the beach. And this can be very harmful for that reptile population. They tend to return to a certain place to lay eggs and to reproduce. And if that area is disturbed or crowded or whatever it is, they don't go anywhere else. They just don't lay eggs. And so there are some areas that are very protected, especially during breeding season. Some of you may have been in Florida or seen like news reports on some of the Florida beaches that are used by sea turtles for laying their eggs. And they will block off the beaches. They will turn off the lights because that's confusing to the turtles as they come up on the beach. And so so we have really made some pretty good strides on helping these animals as far as getting their eggs back and laying their eggs in the right place. So there are these are well-studied animals in a lot of situations. So anyway, pretty cool. Talk to you later.